Great. Thank you so much. And thank you all so much for attending today's talk. So my name is Alice Xiong, and I'm the head of AI ethics at Sony, and also senior research scientist at Sony AI. And so today I'll be speaking on reconciling legal and technical approaches to algorithmic bias. So first, just to provide an overview of my talk. So I'll provide a very, very brief introduction to algorithmic fairness and algorithmic bias. And then I'll talk a little bit about relevant anti-discrimination jurisprudence, and then some of the collisions between what we see in machine learning fairness and the law. And I should specify here that as a US lawyer, my background is primarily in US law, but I will try to abstract up to some of the principles that would be applicable across multiple legal regimes. And then finally, I'll discuss some of the methods to reconcile these legal and technical approaches, and in particular, talk about some of the potential utility of causality and causal notions of fairness. And in case you're interested in a deeper dive on this topic, I do have a paper of the same name, Reconciling Legal and Technical Approaches to Algorithmic Bias. And I'd be happy to drop the link to this paper in the chat after the talk. So first, just to start off, I wanted to briefly address the question or the title of this session, which is algorithmic fairness a legal or technical subject, by saying that, so part of the motivation for this talk is the notion that it is really both. So in order to address algorithmic fairness from a technical perspective, there needs to be a coherence of the methods from a legal perspective. And in fact, importantly, it's that these sorts of technical means for addressing algorithmic fairness cannot be seen as being discriminatory in and of themselves if these are methods that practitioners are to use in practice. And so basically the motivation of this paper is to talk about some of the ways in which these approaches might be at odds and how we might be able to address that. So first off, just to provide a very brief introduction about algorithmic bias and fairness, I like using this quote from statistician George Box, which is that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think this is important because often AI is seen with a lot of mystery and sometimes even mysticism, given the huge amounts of data used and sometimes the superhuman performance that is observed. However, at the end of the day, every AI system is at its root a statistical model. And the nature of models is that they are representations or approximations of reality. So in that sense, all models are going to be wrong. And then the question is, should we still use the models? And here is where algorithmic fairness often becomes an important concern, because in certain cases, maybe the model is useful for some people, but not other people. In certain cases, there are harms that might be specifically distributed towards people who are already marginalized. So these are all considerations we must think about in terms of the deployment of AI. And so just to provide some definitions to start. So of course, algorithmic bias is a broad term and many folks have varying definitions for this. For the purposes of today's talk, I will define algorithmic bias broadly as when machine learning models systematically perform less well for or penalize certain subgroups. And algorithmic fairness in this context is the pursuit of trying to alleviate algorithmic bias, so trying to mitigate algorithmic bias. And as a quick definitional note here, this is distinct from statistical bias for any folks who are coming from more of a technical background. So this is not the expected deviation between your model's predicted value and your ground truth value. And this distinction is important because we are concerned about algorithmic bias, even if there's no statistical bias. And in certain cases, correcting for algorithmic bias might actually introduce statistical bias. So these are very much separate concepts. And in addition, it's important to emphasize here from more of a legal perspective that usually we're not talking about malicious discrimination on the part of human actors, as being the cause of algorithmic bias. Indeed, usually when we are examining algorithmic bias, it's bias that occurs unintentionally and naively. And so that also affects potential legal liabilities. And so to start off this discussion, I wanted to briefly address how folks within the technical community started thinking about issues of bias. And a very popular early approach was by coming up with statistical notions of bias, and specifically a wide variety of fairness metrics, with the goal being to equalize these fairness metrics across different demographic groups. And this is a table that I actually took from Solon's textbook. So if any of you are interested in learning more about this topic, definitely check out his textbook, which I would highly recommend. But as you can see from this table, which is just a very small subset of various types of fairness definitions, there have been a significant number of approaches proposed in the literature that take this sort of notion of defining some sort of metric and then trying to equalize it across demographic groups. So the challenge that this presents to us from more of a legal perspective is the idea of picking one of these fairness metrics and equalizing it across demographic groups is very similar at the end of the day to having a quota, having different thresholds, or doing some sort of balancing across protected attributes. And just to provide a more specific example of that, so the most easy to understand type of fairness metric would be demographic parity, which basically means that you try to have your outcomes from your model's predictions independent of the protected attribute. So let's say if we're doing a hiring example and the protected attribute is gender, if your population has 50-50 men and women, then that would mean your outcomes need to also be 50-50 men and women for the hiring. And so that intuitively, most people would realize is essentially a quota. And so that becomes very problematic when we think about this from a legal fairness perspective. There's also, though, other sorts of fairness metrics that people might not realize as intuitively might lead to some of these problems. So, for example, a very popular fairness metric that people often talk about is this notion of equal opportunity. And so what equal opportunity means is let's try to equalize not the outcomes themselves, but the true positive rates of your model. And so the intuition here is among people who should receive the positive outcome, they should have an equal probability of actually receiving the positive outcome, regardless of their protected attribute. And so the issue here is that if there are differing baselines or distributions across your two different groups, enforcing equal opportunity will yield different thresholds for the different groups. So this is a toy example using some synthetic data that I generated. But you can see here that with these distributions, if you have the same threshold, so 570 for each group, for group A, your true positive rate would be 39%. And for group B, it would be 79%. And I should briefly explain that the context for this toy example is you're using credit score to try to predict whether or not you want to give someone a loan. And so in the lighter color dots, you have repayments, and the darker color dots are defaults. So having the same threshold leads to very different true positive rates. So if we try to enforce equal opportunity, what that would mean in this context would be moving the threshold for group A down from 570 to 490. And so based on the equal opportunity notion of fairness, this is more fair because now you see for people in the lighter color dots, generally a higher proportion of them are going to be given a loan and they will actually repay it. But this, of course, would be very controversial if we tried to do this in practice, because this would mean if you went to a bank to try to apply for a loan, they would ask you, what are you in group A or group B? And then if you were in group A, you have a lower cutoff for your credit score than for group B. So this would be a pretty classic around bias mitigation. And again, this will be somewhat US-centric, but my understanding is that in France, there's actually more restrictions on the use of protected attributes than in the United States. So hopefully this is actually something that is even more so felt. Next. So there's been basically a growing trend in US anti-discrimination law towards what is called anti-classification. And so this is the notion that the law should not classify people based on their protected attributes. And Chief Justice Roberts articulated this notion as being the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. Notably, this sort of notion that you not use protected decision-making also holds in cases where the protected attribute is predictive. So in a separate case, Justice Thurgood Marshall stated that the use of sex-segregated actuarial tables to calculate retirement benefits violates Title VII, whether or not the tables reflect an accurate prediction of the longevity of women as a class. And this is notable in part because it's in contrast to some previous waves of anti-discrimination in the United States, which have focused more on the concept of anti-subordination, which basically means that the law should seek to dismantle existing hierarchies, even if doing so requires some consciousness of protected attributes. And perhaps the most well-known example of this sort of anti-subordination type of thinking is through affirmative action. And the motivation for affirmative action was articulated by President Lyndon Johnson in his commencement address at Howard University in 1965, where he stated, "You do not take a man who for years has been hobbled by chains, liberate him, bring him to the starting line of a race, saying, you are free to compete with all others, and still believe you have been completely fair." And so despite the fact that affirmative action was something that was quite motivating throughout certain phases of US anti-discrimination law, there has been, as we've seen, more application of anti-discrimination to the context of data and machine learning, a strong inclination to approach fairness as blindness. And so just as a few examples of this, so the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, for example, prohibits creditors from considering data on race, sex, or national origin. The New York Department of Finance a couple of years ago issued a circular prohibiting insurers from using data or algorithms based on protected attributes. And the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, in its original proposed rule around disparate impact, would have created a safe harbor for algorithms that do not make use of protected class attributes or close proxies. So these are just a few examples of this notion that maybe we can prevent discrimination by essentially preventing access to data on protected attributes. And so there's a variety of ways in which the machine learning fairness context challenges this notion that we can achieve fairness through blindness. So first off, omitting protected class variables does not prevent bias. And indeed, this concept of trying to remove your protected class variables and close proxies is known in the machine learning community as fairness through unawareness, and is widely considered to be naive. And as an example of why this is considered to be naive, so one very famous example of algorithmic bias was Amazon's resume filtering algorithm in 2018. And in that case, the presence of weak proxies led to discrimination. So what happened was, even though this resume filtering algorithm did not have any direct data about the gender of the applicants, there were many weak signals of gender. Well, there are many weak proxies for gender in the resumes themselves that could still give the model some information about people's gender. So for example, if you went to an all-women's college, or if you were on the women's chess team or the women's track team or anything like that, then that would still be a signal of your gender. And reality is that in the big data context, it's extremely difficult to strip your data of all weak proxies because given the embeddedness of some of these protected attributes in society, pretty much any sort of variable often will have some sort of correlation with your protected attributes. And so in that sense, simply trying to do the whack-a-mole task of removing these sorts of variables is not considered to be a very promising approach to bias mitigation. Also, in contrast to omitting protected class variables, including protected class variables is often very helpful and sometimes critical for actually mitigating bias. And so this does not mean just including the variables directly in your feature set, but instead there are very specific methods people have developed in the literature that are aimed at actively reversing the bias trends. And if you are going to reverse the bias trends, you need to actually take into account which groups people are in. And I'll also provide an example of this later. But essentially, so the problem or tension that we have here is anti-classification, or this general notion of fairness through blindness, could render most methods to address algorithmic bias illegal. And it's important to note that this is not just a theoretical concern that occurs when you study the machine learning and legal literatures. This is also a major problem in practice. And so in an interview study that my co-authors and I conducted, we found that practitioners struggle in practice to even detect bias in their models due to privacy and anti-discrimination law concerns. And so, for example, one product manager at a major social media company that we spoke with stated that every time they do an algorithmic assessment, people always ask them, where's race? And the reality is that they are not able to actually check for racial bias in their models because they don't have any data on race. And even if they were able to find some evidence of bias, it's unclear what exactly they would do if they weren't able to do any sort of bias mitigation that takes into account the protected attribute. And so now I'll move into some potential defenses that have been proposed in the literature. And there are many of these, so given today's timing, I'll only focus on a couple of them, but certainly check out the paper if you want to see more. So first off, some folks have proposed this idea of what if we try to do disparate learning processes. And so the idea here is basically, why don't we just use the protected attribute in training, but not in deployment? So essentially we'll train a model that takes into account the protected attribute. Then we will zero out that attribute by, for example, zeroing out the coefficient attached to that attribute. And so that way the model that's actually deployed in practice will not have in its feature set the protected attribute. And so some problems with this kind of approach are that first off, this distinction between training and deployment might not actually be relevant from a legal perspective. So as we discussed earlier, there's a hesitancy even to allow access to these attributes to begin with, let alone whether these attributes are used in training versus deployment. So it's unclear that this would really solve things from a legal standpoint, at least in the United States. And then from a technical standpoint, this is not advantageous given that there is sometimes important contextual value that you can gain from protected attributes that can be helpful both from a fairness and bias mitigation perspective, but also from an accuracy perspective. So here is another toy example using data that I synthesized. And the toy example here is that, let's say we are trying to decide who to hire for a software engineering position. And so we're developing a model to help us sort through resumes. And essentially, so we have historical data on people's performance reviews as software engineers. And we also have data on their resume characteristics. And one of these characteristics that we think might be predictive is the number of elective CS courses taken. And so the intuition here is maybe if you took a lot of extra CS courses, maybe that means you're very interested in computer science, so you'll be very good at software engineering. Maybe you also know more because you took all of these classes. So if we take a blinded approach to this, which is what we see on the left-hand side, so everyone looks the same, we see a very strong positive correlation. And so if we just go with this blinded approach, then we would say, okay, well, this looks great. In that case, we can use this as a strong feature for predicting whether people will have a good performance if we hire them as software engineers. On the other hand, though, in this non-blinded example, where we have, we can see the differences in trends for those in the majority group versus in the minority group. Here in this example, we have very different trends. So it's a very strong positive correlation for those in the majority group, but basically no significant trend for those in the minority group. And so one explanation here could be that for those in the minority group, perhaps they feel that the CS department is not necessarily the most inclusive environment for them. Maybe they don't see many folks who are role models or mentors for them. Maybe they don't have many friends who are in that department. For whatever reason, perhaps they feel excluded from the department. And so they are willing to take the courses they need to in order to fulfill their degree. But maybe after they do that, whether or not they take any further courses is not necessarily a signal of their interest, their intrinsic interest in computer science or their ability in computer science, but instead is a very noisy signal. So if this were the case, then ideally what we would want from both a fairness and an accuracy perspective is to be able for folks who are in the majority group to take into account this number of elective CS courses taken as a signal. But for those in the minority group, this is not a very relevant signal. So we would not want to use this sort of information. So that's one example where you might want to take into account the influence of protected attributes on the interpretation of these other features, because basically it's a very clear, nice interpretation in the context of those in the majority group, but not a very clear interpretation for those in the minority group. And focusing a lot on this feature could further penalize students that already feel marginalized in their department. And so that's why disparate learning processes are not necessarily the right approach. So another approach that people have proposed is, okay, so if we can't, for legal reasons, use gender, race, those sorts of features, why don't we try to use some proxies? So some proxies would be variables that are correlated with these features, but are not considered to be very legally sensitive. So let's say like names or zip codes, those sorts of features. And so the problem with this kind of approach is it's actually very analogous to many of the long-standing debates that we've seen around whether we should move from race-based affirmative action to class-based affirmative action. And so this graph is actually from a previous paper that I did that was actually looking at whether we could achieve similar outcomes if we moved to a socioeconomically based affirmative action system. And what you see here is that moving from a race-based affirmative action system to a class-based affirmative action system, so race-based is in light blue, class-based is in darker blue, essentially ends up replacing many of the racial minority students with socioeconomic minority students that are in the majority racial group. And this basically illustrates in practice what is a pretty straightforward concept, which is that if you have a very strong proxy, so there's a ton of overlap between your proxy variable and the variable you're trying to avoid using, then arguably it's too similar to just using the protected attribute itself. Whereas if you're looking at something like race and class, then that is a proxy, but it's still a relatively weak proxy. And indeed, it can lead to separate, it's better to think about race and class as being intersectional challenges rather than ones that completely overlap. And so if you use this sort of weak proxy, you will probably not achieve your desired outcomes and could ironically still make it difficult for folks in the group that you are trying to advantage because you're using this proxy that actually mostly benefits people in a different group. So all of this is just to say, basically, in practice, blindness rarely achieves the fairest or most accurate outcomes. And so this is just a mock-up of what the Pareto frontier might look like, where this line is, in theory, the optimal trade-off between fairness and accuracy. And generally, any approach that achieves fairness and accuracy through blindness is not necessarily going to be the fairest or most accurate approach. So what would I propose instead in terms of how should we try to go about reconciling these legal and technical approaches? So first off, so an important consideration in this space is possibly looking at causal fairness as a solution. And so to explain what causal fairness means, I'll take as example a pre-processing approach to this. So what we're often trying to address with algorithmic bias is bias trends in the data itself. So instead of trying to look at some aggregate statistic about differences in outcomes across groups under your model, if you are looking at the data itself and saying, if the person were of a different protected attribute, what would their outcome have been? In another version, if everyone were treated as if they were in the advantage group, what would their outcomes have been? Then that's a more direct way to address this question of discrimination, because essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to estimate the counterfactual situation where if this person had not been discriminated against, what would their outcomes have been? And if you were able to do that, so if you were able to essentially create estimates of what this counterfactual universe would be like if people were not discriminated against, then you can train your model without having to worry about these issues of discrimination. So the nice properties of this kind of framing of what we're trying to do with bias mitigation is it directly targets the bias trends in the data. And it also separates out different effects. So one problem with a lot of statistical notions of fairness is they conflate differences in baselines across populations with the effects of discrimination. And that's important because what we see at least a lot in US anti-discrimination law is any efforts to simply address societal discrimination as a whole tend to be very controversial and tend to often receive claims of reverse discrimination because they are not targeted to specific types of discrimination. So being able to articulate what is specifically the relevant effect of discrimination that you are trying to reverse is very helpful to prevent that sort of challenge. And in addition to that, causality has some very nice interpretations from a legal perspective. So at least in the United States, discrimination is defined as making a decision because of a protected attribute. And so one way to think of this is, would you or your model have made the same decision, but for the individual's race, sex, national origin, so on and so forth? And so despite the fact that what we've seen in many specific examples of regulations in this space is the focus on presence and absence of protected attribute, the actual goal has not been to look at the presence or absence of protected attributes so much as this causal question. So if we take causal fairness as our approach to bias mitigation, it's actually much more aligned with the fundamental legal question at stake. And it also can avoid some of these not very helpful questions about the presence and absence of protected attributes. In addition, there's further benefits for thinking about fairness in a causal way. So for one, it allows distinctions to be made between different use cases of protected class attributes. So are you using this protected class attribute in a way that makes your algorithm more versus less biased? Or more concretely, are you increasing or decreasing the causal relationship between the protected class attribute and your model's predictions or decisions? And so again, this allows us to focus on what is the most relevant question rather than the questions of, did you use a protected class attribute? And then finally on this, going briefly back to the CS courses example, this helps us separate out causation versus correlation, because whereas all the statistical notions of fairness focus on correlation, as we discussed with this example, not all correlations with protected attributes are necessarily harmful. And there are ways in which protected attributes can be leveraged to actually reduce instead of increase discrimination. And then kind of zooming out one layer as well. So even if we're not thinking about specifically bias mitigation, it's also helpful to keep in mind that a lot of the fairness questions or problems we're dealing with are related to the fact that machine learning is predictive, but when we're talking about a lot of the high stakes scenarios where we care about algorithmic fairness, decision-making is causal. And so just to illustrate this, so machine learning is very well suited for problems where we purely just want the right answer from a predictive perspective. So a prediction problem would be, for instance, what will the demographics of inmates be in the next few years? So if this is all we care about, say we're social scientists trying to do a study on this, then it's okay if the algorithm learns that people in minority groups are more likely to be rearrested due to police bias. In this case, the problem is purely descriptive, and we want our model to accurately reflect the bias trends. And in fact, we might be doing this study precisely in part because we want to highlight the problems of bias in the law enforcement system. On the other hand, if we are doing a decision problem, so here we want to know, if we do not incarcerate this individual, will they recidivate? So will they commit another offense? And here it is absolutely not okay if the algorithm predicts that someone has a higher chance of rearrest just because they are in a minority group. And here, this is because the decision-making problem has more of a normative sense to it. So if you learn something that is a descriptive trend, but is a trend for the wrong reasons, it's due to existing bias and discrimination, then learning that trend will unjustly perpetuate the bias trends. And so this is just another way in which shifting our thinking from this purely predictive ML context to a more causal framework can be helpful for redressing some of these fairness problems. And so this is both notably a technical and a legal solution. So I've kind of focused on this in part more so in terms of the techniques that people should approach, and this idea that you should focus on fairness techniques with causal interpretations. But this is also a suggestion for judges and regulators to focus more on assessing causality rather than the visibility of or presence of protected class attributes, which are a less useful way of assessing fairness. So to conclude, some of the main takeaways from today's talk are that, first off, legal compatibility is necessary for addressing algorithmic bias. There are currently legal hurdles that make it quite difficult for practitioners to actually address algorithmic bias in practice. And in particular, there is a tension between the technical need to consider protected class attributes in order to mitigate and honestly also to detect bias, and the law's preference for decision-making that is blind or neutral to these attributes. And causal fairness can help to resolve some of this tension by helping us to distinguish between different use cases of protected attributes, and hopefully thus making it possible to prevent the proliferation of biased algorithms while permitting the use case of bias mitigation techniques. And so with that, thank you all so much for listening to today's talk, and I would be very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Alice, for your very, very rich and stimulating presentation. So we'll have a discussion afterwards. So I suggest that we move on to second speaker, Solon, BAROCAS. Thank you for being here also. So Solon, I give you the floor for 20 to 30 minutes.
Great. Thanks very much. Can everyone see my slides? Yes, great. Okay, let me actually do a slideshow. Still able to see everything? Great. Okay.
Yes, it's fine.
Yeah, we have it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So thanks very much for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure to join you. I was able to be the first system. I think I'll pick up on some themes that have come up already over the course of the day. I'll actually be presenting some work in progress, and in fact, this is very early work. So hopefully I'll have some interesting things to share with you, but I also would very much welcome people's feedback on this because this is quite early in its development. This is some joint work with Manish Raghavan. Manish was a computer science student at Cornell and is now a postdoc at Harvard. I've somewhat abused my privilege as a speaker to kind of present some work that's somewhat more focused on explanations rather than the kind of broader question of the difference between the technical and legal notions of fairness. But I'll try to explain how even this work speaks to broader questions about how to conceptualize fairness. And so I'll just say at the outset that this is a project that's sort of asking about whose interests are advanced when we give explanations of particular machine learning decisions. In particular, it's grounded on a discussion of the use of machine learning in finance, where, as I'll point out in just a few minutes, there are, at least in the United States, some legal obligations to provide explanation of adverse decisions to consumers. So let me explain why Manish and I find this to be a helpful place to kind of ground our discussion. So in much of the existing work on explanation in machine learning, and even in fairness in the use of machine learning in finance generally, lending decisions are often presented as binary, meaning that the lender is simply deciding whether or not to lend to someone. But in practice, these models are really used to estimate consumers' risks of default, not simply to classify them as creditworthy or not, right? So this is a continuous score, not a classification task. And these estimates are used to inform often more complex decision, often a subjective decision, about the terms on which lenders are going to be willing to grant credit to consumers. So not only are they making a decision about whether or not to grant, but they're making decisions about on what interest rate, or with what repayment schedule, or with what down payment. And though I'm not familiar with lending or mortgages in France or Europe, my impression is that these terms are kind of common across the way lending is conducted around the world. And so while this stylized view of finance makes it very tractable for a lot of the work that's been done both on fairness and on explanation in machine learning, it's not really in keeping with the more multifaceted way in which lenders are making these decisions. And this is quite important. So Consumer Reports is an organization that releases a magazine. It's actually kind of a consumer rights organization that often does independent research on commercial actors to kind of review the quality of the products they produce, but also does sometimes original journalism. And this is a piece from just a few months ago that I would encourage many of you to look at. It's a lengthy article kind of showing that many Americans end up paying much more for their car loans than might seem to be justified by their credit scores. And this is an empirical analysis. I won't get into all the details here, but some of the findings are quite shocking, where there's not necessarily a tight relationship between credit scores and the terms that people receive when they get a loan for a car. And so it turns out that the interest rates that some people might be paying can be quite out of step with their underlying credit score. And the speculation that this author makes, and that many of the experts he consulted suggest as well, is that the terms that people end up paying are not really a reflection merely of the underlying risk of default, but of their willingness to pay. So this concept from economics, which refers to the fact that people might be willing to pay a certain amount for a good or an opportunity. and that lenders are sort of exploiting that, end up charging them terms that are much more profitable for the lender. Okay, so I think what this kind of points out is that in the absence of actually clear details about the terms that people are receiving, a significant amount of disparity in lending terms can be concealed by simply focusing on whether or not people gain access to credit at all. So if you were to kind of do a direct comparison across access to credit, you might see that it looks that different groups are largely able to obtain access to credit at similar rates. But what you might not be able to see is that the terms upon which they actually gain access to credit are radically different. And that's exactly what you see in this report I just mentioned. And I think finance is a kind of unique situation because access to credit on unfavorable terms can be actively harmful to consumers, even if it actually turns out to be profitable for the lender. Right? So naively kind of improving access to credit without recognizing that there can be harm that comes along from unfavorable terms, I think is a unique danger here in the context of credit. As I mentioned, there are existing legal obligations in the United States that require that lenders actually explain their adverse decisions to consumers. So for example, when someone applies for a loan and it's rejected, they are actually supposed to receive a list of reasons for why they were rejected. This has largely been understood as a kind of classification question, right? So was the person's application successful or not? And if not, give a reason. But the law is actually more specific in a way that I think is often ignored. So I quote here part of Ecole, the first statute mentioned above, which says that adverse actions are defined to include a refusal to grant credit in substantially the amount or in substantially the terms requested in an application. So what this actually means is that even if an application is successful, if it is on worse terms than the applicant actually wanted, they're still entitled to an explanation for receiving the less favorable terms. And in practice, I don't think this is actually necessarily respected by many lenders. I don't think people actually get these kinds of explanations, but the law at least seems to require it. Okay, so let me now dig in a little bit deeper into why access to credit is not an unmitigated good and why this then complicates the way we should think about both fairness and explanations. So first, it can impose serious costs on consumers. So if applicants default, they may be subject to a range of penalties. So if this is a secure loan or there's collateral, actual property can be seized, for example. But even in other cases, simply having their credit report damage can irreversibly change their ability to access credit in the future. And so there are real consequences to consumers who are unable to manage these loans. And interestingly, can impose serious costs on lenders as well, which almost always will then spill over to consumers, right? So if a larger set of people begin to default, how to deal with that. So they might, for example, just try to accept amount of additional losses, or they might incur costs in attempting to secure payment or collateral, right? So to seize the collateralized property, for example. But whatever they might do, lenders invariably are going to pass those costs on to other consumers, likely in the form of higher prices, more restricted lending terms, or both. Meaning that lenders who begin to kind of give out loans that are resulting in more defaults will end up having to raise interest rates or make the lending terms more restrictive to compensate for those additional costs. And so the harms that are initially falling to the set of consumers that are defaulting will spill over to other consumers as well. So again, sort of naively giving out credit here can have harms not just to the applicants, but to the people who are otherwise also seeking to apply in the future. Let's see, sorry, I'm just moving around some windows. And if this was not obvious enough, lender welfare and consumer welfare can diverge dramatically here, right? So decisions that might actually advance the welfare of one can harm the welfare of another. And again, in the existing literature, this is often kind of conceived as a win-win situation for consumers and lenders. If we can figure out a way to extend credit to more people, that's great for everyone. But it's clear if you think about this for a moment that different lending arrangements can favor one party more than another. So any discussion that you might have about lending invariably will probably remind you to think about things like predatory lending or usurious interest rates. And I think these are meant to capture the idea that access to credit can be incredibly profitable for the lender, even if it ends up being unbearable for the applicant. And I think what is really important to recognize here is like what would actually count as the ideal candidate for example, a credit card from the perspective of a lender. And much of the literature, it's sort of presumed that it's like, you know, the person who can pay down their balance each month in full. But actually, what would be ideal is something like this in the second bullet point, which is someone who carries a large balance, only makes monthly minimum payments, tolerates a high interest rate, occasionally misses payments and racks up lucrative fines, and does this in perpetuity, right? And so when we're thinking about lenders' decisions, we should not think that they're simply trying to minimize default. They're trying to do something much more complicated here, which is like maximize profit using a variety of levers at their disposal. Okay. And they're able to do this because there can be different views on the value.
I'm having trouble here.
Sorry. There can be different perspectives on the immediate value of the value of immediate access to money. So for example, for consumers, money now is often much more valuable than money later. That's exactly the proposition that I think they're undertaking when they seek a loan. And they may be willing to pay quite a significant amount of money for that privilege, but with the kind of cost of repayment spread out over time. In contrast, you know, lenders might not really care about having all their money readily available, so long as they actually understand that there will be a steady cash flow and they can kind of plan around that. And so the value of immediate access to money is different, which allows them to kind of adopt quite different positions on this arrangement. And as I mentioned, you know, while lenders might prefer to avoid default, it is not catastrophic for them, right? They're trying to ensure profits, not trying to eliminate risk altogether. And it may be sufficient for lenders to simply recoup the principal and draw some profits from the loan, even if it ends up in default, right? So again, here, the calculation that the lender is making is to how to ensure that the loan that they make is profitable, not necessarily something that avoids default. While in contrast, as I was already saying, default can just be enormously costly for consumers, right? So very different perspectives on default. And similarly, there can be different perspectives on interest rates, right? So in general, we can think of interest rates as a mechanism to help offset risk, right? So if, you know, someone has like a 10% chance of default, you might set the interest rate accordingly, along with other people who have similar chances of defaulting, to compensate for the fact that in this kind of bucket of people with 10% probability of default, you know, 10 out of 100 of them will actually default. And you can set interest rates for all those people accordingly to make sure that as a group, you'll still be profitable. Right? However, interest rates are not set only to offset risk. They're also the main mechanism by which lenders make profit. And so, as I've been saying, because consumers can derive a value from access to money that may be in excess of what is strictly necessary for lenders to cover their costs, they might be willing to pay quite a bit more than what is strictly necessary. And lenders will often then set prices or interest rates not only according to the underlying risk of default, but according to what consumers might be willing to pay. And this allows then lenders to capture much more of the surplus, right? The surplus being the difference between how much the consumer would be willing to pay and how much the lender would be willing to offer. Okay. So what this gets to is that there just can be quite a bit of difference in the preferences over outcomes, right? So like what actual lending terms does the consumer want versus what are the lending terms that the applicant wants? And in the context of what we've been talking about, you can see here, so if you think of if you see my cursor, you can think of this area as the range of terms that would be acceptable to the lender. And so the axes here are the interest rates and the amount of risk of default presented by the applicant, right? So as the risk of default goes up, you can see that, you know, the the terms, the interest rates that would be acceptable to the lender become more higher and higher, right? Whereas in general here, basically the consumer, this area here, maybe has some upper threshold of how much they'd be willing to pay in terms of interest, but it's pretty consistent across the level of risk, right? And if it turns out that the predicted risk of the applicant is where this dotted line is, right, there might be no overlap between the terms that would be agreeable to the consumer and to the lender. And it's only this region here that would be mutually agreeable, okay? And this has consequences then for the way that we might want to go about explaining these decisions, right? So for example, if we think of these regions as being the same as I just described above, where the crisscross here is where it's mutually agreeable, you can imagine an explanation that says something along the lines of, well, under your current circumstances, which is represented by this dot here, we would not be willing to lend to you at all, okay? But if you took actions to move into this region, we would be willing to lend to you. And so we would basically say, change the value of this feature 2 to be such that you're in this region. But this is, not particularly helpful for the consumer who is just not willing to accept a loan on these terms. And instead, it's this area here where you would actually want to direct them. So the explanation not given, but that could have been given, is to change instead the value of feature 1, which would have moved them to this region, which would have been mutually agreeable to both the lender and to the applicant. But note further too here that, it's quite interesting that it wouldn't really matter how much the applicant would progress in this direction, right? So they can actually increase the value of feature 2 indefinitely, but they would never actually get to the better terms that they would want, right? So not only is the direction here wrong, but the magnitude of the change doesn't even really matter. Okay. And what this kind of suggests is that, there might be some natural tendency to favor the welfare of lenders when giving these kinds of explanations, because they're likely to try to minimize the effort that the applicant will have to spend to get to the other side of the boundary. But these are likely to be the least favorable terms to the consumer, right? And I think what's even more dangerous here is that the consumer might even misunderstand the nature of the explanation. So if you assume that the lender is simply trying to minimize defaults, you might think that the explanation someone gets for how to achieve a successful outcome in the future is equivalent to instructions for how to avoid default, right? But that's not actually the case here. What the lender is trying to do is to maximize profit. And so when someone is actually acting on the explanations have been given, they might unknowingly be actually placing themselves at much more risk because they don't recognize that those actions are only those that make them attractive candidates for credit, meaning profitable, not necessarily less likely to default. And so I think it's entirely possible that people will take actions that result in them gaining access to credit, but on terms that are much more risky than they recognize. Okay, so what does this all have to say about these various topics? Well, I think a couple of things. So recall that the law, at least in the United States, already requires that lenders actually offer explanations to applicants who receive offers of credit on less favorable terms than requested. It may be easy to deal with this problem when consumers are actually requesting specific terms, right? So if I ask for something explicitly, this is the interest rate I want, and this is the down payment I'm willing to pay, then people are going to get explanations with respect to what they've requested. But this puts the burden on consumers to know which terms to request in the first place. And it is incredibly easy to under or overshoot the mark, right? So it may be that I'm asking for an interest rate that I perceive to be, pretty favorable to me. And I'll get explanations with respect to that, but I'll never actually realize that I could have gotten an even lower interest rate had I asked for it. Right? That's just not a possibility given the way this has been set up. And worse, when we don't get to specify the terms that we want from our loan, then it's not really clear the point of comparison that should serve as the basis for generating these explanations, right? So instead, it's much more likely that lenders will just default to those terms that advance their own interests. And you can imagine this being the case often in situations like with credit cards and things of that sort, where these terms are not always exhaustively specified in advance. Right. So I think this kind of suggests a few different things with respect to explanation, but I'll say also something in closing about fairness more generally. So I think for the more obvious thing I think this means for explanation is that we need to develop techniques that are actually useful for non-binary settings, right? Where the decision maker is not just choosing whether or not to lend, but has many other terms that they are setting. And further, we need those techniques to incorporate the fact that the decision maker and the decision subject might have very different preferences over those outcomes. And right now, because the kind of imagined way decision making is happening is so simplified, it's likely going to be the case that this is all oriented in the direction of the interest of the lender. Okay, and let me just then maybe step back and say something finally here about like the broader questions about fairness. And I think what this kind of area of research also I think reveals is that talking in general about binary outcomes can just conceal a huge amount of additional concern that so far, in my opinion, has not really received enough attention in the kind of broader work on fairness and machine learning. So we can analogize the same scenario to employment, right? So the fact that different groups might be employed at the same rate could still conceal the fact that they're receiving completely different salaries, right? So the gender pay gap can be enormous, even if men and women are being hired at comparable rates. And so this is not really a problem that is unique to finance. I also think it's worth thinking about the kind of spillover effects, as I was mentioning earlier, of making decisions that can then be harmful to the people who receive the desired outcome, right? So when we begin to lend to people who are more likely to default, not only those people harmed, but the entire lending system could be harmed because it increases the cost of credit for everyone. And I think this too needs to be kind of considered in the way that we're developing ideas of fairness in these situations. So while I focus on explanations here, I think there's kind of broader questions that even ask about how to conceptualize fairness generally when we begin to take into account these kinds of dynamics. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Solon, for this very stimulating presentation. I like the idea, I think we discussed further on, precise idea of perfect perverse effects of explanation. Because you agree that explanation can lead to more risky loans for consumers. So it's interesting. Thank you, Solon. So I move now to the Aurélien GARIVIER, the speaker session. Aurélien, thank you for being here. I'll give you the floor right now if you want to open your presentation.
Yes, so I'll share my screen if that's okay with everyone. Where is it? No. Should be this one. Okay, so from now on,
that's fine, we have it.
Yeah. So you can see the first slide. Unfortunately, I don't see now what you can see, but anyway, this is fine.
We have the title slide.
Excellent.
The first one, yeah.
So thank you very much, Thierry, for the invitation, and thank you to let me participate in this wonderful workshop. At first, I would like to present myself and to say who is speaking for this talk. So actually, I'm a researcher on the technical side. I'm not at all a lawyer. I'm a mathematician in the first place. And I'm one of the very, very many participants in the arguably largest conference in machine learning, which is called NeurIPS, which takes place right now. So this year, unfortunately, it's only remotely, but 2 years ago, it was in Canada. And so we are extremely numerous. The number of papers on artificial intelligence is growing very rapidly. And the community, the research effort in the direction of artificial intelligence is really huge. And among all of these people, well, most are technically oriented and want to solve problems, like engineers, if you want, except that those problems don't have solutions so far. We don't know if they have solutions or not. So they are actually doing some research. Just among them, a few are very concerned with the implications of their research and the fact that it has a positive social impact. In particular, a conference like NeurIPS really has made a lot of effort to highlight these aspects and to insist on the responsibility of researchers. And so this takes them into at least try to have an interdisciplinary approach, trying to work with lawyers, with philosophers, or with other specialists to try to understand in the end what they are doing and the implications of what they are doing. And it's not an easy subject. I mean, it's pretty unusual in our world. People with my background in mathematics are rarely taken into doing this kind of things. Usually the social implication of mathematical research is very, very low. And so it's not really an issue. But yes, it seems that machine learning and artificial intelligence have reached a point where it has really become necessary. So it's not easy at all. Speaking with a lawyer is extremely difficult. Understanding what she says is extremely difficult for me, but I'm trying my best. And reciprocally, it's always difficult to know exactly what we are speaking about. There are lots of confusions everywhere in the media, but even in pretty specialized speeches over artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence is not necessarily the same thing as algorithmic decision making. And so there are specificities in the problems it poses with responsibility and with fairness. So maybe I will first in my presentation try to present an overly simplified but still framework, I think, view of what artificial intelligence is and why we are now, we mathematicians, computer scientists, taken into working on problems that we didn't have to think about even 10 or 15 years ago. And I will present some of the solutions, or at least starts of solutions that we are proposing, but from our perspective, and our perspective is a technical perspective. And I'll also try to discuss what this technical perspective is. And I think the interest of such a day is precisely to try to make explicit and easily understandable what the different point of views are and what the different actors are taking for solutions. So first, speaking about artificial intelligence, I will try to briefly tell why the success, why the questions, and what are the, and why these reflections about responsibility. And I'll start with a very basic slide explaining what is a computer. So a computer, what is it? It's just a machine able to combine arbitrarily a small set of elementary operations on some data. So what is important here is the fact that there are a small set of operations, but that you can combine them arbitrarily. And usually speaking, when you work in computer science, when you're an engineer and you want to use a computer to solve a problem, you specify this problem as a correspondence. So telling you that on some input, you want some output. For example, if you want to use a computer to sort an array of numbers, then you want an array of numbers to enter as it is in whatever order. And you want the operations made by the computer to be such that in the end, you get the same numbers, but in increasing order. So this is the first problem. The second example problem is translation. So if you have written Le Petit Chat in French, maybe you want your computer to translate it into English. And so you want the output to be the little cat. Or maybe you want to do image recognition. In that case, what you get is a pixelized image of, say, a digit, if you want to recognize digits. And what you want is your program to recognize in this image. So the entry of your program will be an image, and the output should be an internal representation of a number in your computer. And the last example I'm giving here on this slide is contour detection. So if you want in an image to automatically detect what are the contours of the different objects in this image. So here you have an example. So this is a problem in computer science in general. And what is a solution is a description of a way to use the computer to build the output from the input. And essentially, so this is where I'm making things a little more simple than they are, but still it's a good thing to understand. Essentially, there are two ways to use a computer to solve these problems. There is the classical way and there is the artificial intelligence way. The classical way is to tell exactly to the computer what is the list of elementary operations that it should do to build the output from the input. For example, if you want to sort this list, maybe you can tell the computer, well, first you read the list from left to right and you get the smallest number in the list. Then you put it in the first position and then you continue the same process with the other numbers. And in the end, after reading this list 5 times, you will have the numbers in the correct order. So this is called programming. So this is in the technical language of computer science, exactly what I just told, the procedure to sort the list with what is called bubble sort, taking the smallest number to the first place. So this is the way most problems are solved in computer science. And when you are training an engineer, 99% of what you are teaching him is to solve problems like this. So it's kind of a reductionism. You reduce the complex problem to a list of very elementary operations that the computer is able to do. The problem is that it works well on most tasks. So surprisingly, for example, the last task, contour detection, I'm suggesting here is very well treated by such a direct programming approach. So it's not because the task seems to be difficult that it cannot be solved by this reduction. Just it happens that some tasks are really hard to solve with this approach. For example, recognizing a number in an image, so a digit in an image, it's very difficult to reduce it to a list of operations. So here that would be reading the pixels and try to write directly the correspondence between the pixels you read and the number you should recognize. So for example, in order to recognize a 0, you might want to say, oh, I want to count the number of pixels that are hot on the outside of the image. I want to subtract the number of pixels that are hot in the center of the image. And if the difference is very large, well, my image is likely to be a 0. Okay, that might work. You can try this approach, this classical approach to do image recognition. The problem is it will be very long and very inefficient. And what is a lot more efficient in that case is to do artificial intelligence. So what is artificial intelligence? You don't write the program to recognize the digits. You use the computer to find itself the program that will do the matching. So it's a kind of meta programming approach where you use the computer to build the program. You don't do it yourself. And in particular, in machine learning, what you are using is that you are using a lot of examples and you feed your machine learning algorithm with all these examples. And from the examples, it learns to build the program that will make the correspondence on future data. Okay, so this distinction should be clear in order to understand what we are talking about. For example, algorithmic decision-making may include a system for allocating students to some training program. So this kind of automatic algorithmic decision-making is not at all artificial intelligence. It has nothing to see with artificial. It's not because there's a computer involved that it is artificial intelligence. And the problem with artificial intelligence is that it has other difficulties with responsibilities than the classical way of programming. So let's first see why you are speaking so much about artificial intelligence for since say 10 years. Well, because in some tasks, it has performed in a way that was completely unexpected. For example, on image recognition, so the analysis of images, recognizing objects on images, So the field was investigated for very long, but with very, very poor successes so far. And in 10 years, the quality of the way computers are doing this job has just completely changed. So this is also true in natural language processing. The way, for example, to obtain an automatic translation from one language to another is incomparable now than even 10 years ago. And those two skills can be combined together. And now you can feed an image into a computer, and it will give you as an output a description of what you can see on this image, which was 20 years ago not even conceivable. So the successes of artificial intelligence are not universal. They are not, artificial intelligence hasn't changed all the face of all disciplines. For example, as you can see in the COVID crisis right now, we don't speak so much about artificial intelligence with COVID. Artificial intelligence hasn't provided any solution for COVID. It may come one day, but so far it's not very impressive what has been obtained from artificial intelligence in that field. The third, there are two massive successes: image recognition and natural language processing. And there is another one, which is strategical thinking. So the progress in strategical thinking has been very much improved. Also, I want to insist on the success you all have heard about of a computer program called AlphaGo to beat all the human players in a game, so Go, that was supposed to be extremely difficult for computers, exactly because of what I was saying. It's almost impossible, given a situation of the game of Go, to describe the elementary computations you can do to find the best stroke you should play. So there is no way no decomposition way, no classical way of programming this. And the artificial intelligence way has provided solutions that appear to be extremely efficient, a lot too much for human players right now. So when you combine the capacity to sense your environment, for example, see objects, and have strategies, reasoning, you can combine them and obtain autonomous vehicles, so autonomous agents, cars or this kind of small animals that are extremely impressive in what they are able to do. And this is not only in prototypes, but also on business and everyday life that you have been massively impacted. The other example where artificial intelligence has made a lot of progress is in recommender systems. So when you are suggested content that is assumed to interest you. So the most obvious one is the Netflix system for movie recommendation that you all have heard about. So the implications on everyday life are massive. And how are these different successes obtained? So the first thing to understand that is very important if you want to have an impact on the way research is made and to have a meaningful legislative action on artificial intelligence is that all this success has been made possible by an incredible abstraction. That is to say, whether you wanted to sell, I don't know, a movie to a player, or whether you wanted to find the best treatment for some disease, or whether you wanted to recognize a pet in an image, or all of these kind of things, well, these problems were all cast into the same theoretical framework, which is learn an abstract mapping from one set to another set. And mostly, this mapping was from a set of vectors, of numbers. You can imagine that your data is an Excel sheet and that you want to predict the class of this Excel sheet. So this is an oversimplification, of course, but the message is important, that abstraction was extremely important in the process of the success of machine learning. To put it differently, when you wanted to recognize an object in an image, it was more, it proved more powerful to forget completely about images and image processing and what exactly you are wanting to recognize, or if you wanted to work in medicine, completely forget that you are working in medicine and to find general solvers, general programs for learning relationships, and then apply them to all separate fields. And this proved to be efficient and to be the good way to do it. And why? Because people invented pretty smart ways to learn this correspondence by using massively very powerful computers. So the methods are all now computationally intensive, whether they stem from statistical learning. So some models are inspired by statistics, by really models in the sense of statistics. Some are inspired by different things. So it's hard to call a neural network a statistical model. Historically, it's not so much. So statistics are considering the neural networks and try to analyze them from a statistics point of view. But this analysis so far is not extremely convincing and does not catch really the success of neural nets. And so what you should remember here is that there are several strategies, some inspired by different engineering or bio-inspired views, some from computations and mathematics. But anyway, all of them require lots of computations and in the end are pretty hard to understand. So in a way, the code that all these methods are producing is not a simple sequence of operations that you can easily understand like this if you are familiar with programming. It's really how full computations that you don't really master now even as a computer scientist. And well, the difficulty with this approach now is that the program you are using in the end was not only produced by you by a strong methodology, but is the output of a computation made by a computer. And so who is accountable? Who is responsible for this? It's not so clear, it's difficult. So first, the code itself, the process was not produced by the formalization of a way of thinking, as I explained you how to sort this list here, but is the outcome of a complex procedure optimizing on all possible programs. Second, there is a dilution of the responsibility because several actors are involved. So the data here is largely responsible for the outcome and the performance of the outcome you will have. The choice of the learning algorithm, I told you there were several. The learning algorithms themselves, so when you use them, we will see an example later, some are more unfair than others for very difficult reasons. The fact that you get a program that is very hard to audit or to inspect, neural networks are just lists of coefficients that are very difficult to understand. And in fact, yes, from the outside, they seem to be pretty impenetrable. So there's a lot of difficulty to explain or even interpret the results. So in my view, this is important to understand that the decision-making made by artificial intelligence programs is more, the question of responsibility is more difficult than for the general algorithmic decision-making algorithm. So if you are writing the program, one can look at the program and ask you, so here, what did you take that decision when this variable was equal to that? And you are responsible for this choice. In the case of machine learning, you are not, and it's very difficult to see. And the outcome of all those methods is that they are able to produce amazing prototypes, amazing programs that are able to work to do things we wouldn't have expected them to do. But when you put them in the real life, they seem to be pretty frightening. And for example, when you are a plane constructor and you want to use these methods to make automatic pilot in a plane, well, it's really a lot of questions that you are wanting to solve. And so now we have reached the point where the prototypes tend to be used for real life. When those powerful tools seem to be ready for entering really the is connecting, or at least capacity of his facial recognition systems because of the number of problems that it is posing, from social surveillance to everything. So why did you come to this?
You have 10 minutes left to complete your presentation. Is it okay?
Of course, yes. It is perfectly fine. Thank you.
Okay.
So why those? What are the causes of this crisis? Well, the causes are that systems, when you use them, are causing some troubles and have shown some biases in particular. And I'm very thankful to Alice XIANG, who has already explained a lot on this problem of biases. I will show you just a few examples of what this bias can be.
El evento está en virtual. ¿Puedo alcanzar a entrar y hacer una pregunta?
Sorry?
El evento está virtual. También. Para que me vean.
Can I continue? Distance to applications, and it's a kind of way to get irresponsible for what you are constructing. Besides, once you have formalized the problem into a model, you are fixing the rules of the game, and those rules itself have biases in what the solution will, how the solutions will behave. For example, the general goal admitted for this machine learning algorithm is maximize the average performance. So this is nice, but it can have strong side effects that were not thought before. For example, it will favor the dominant view. It will not be robust. It will not be reliable. At least there is no guarantee about this. Besides, the way research is moving forward is by some challenges. Typically, the problem is posed to the community, and all the researchers are trying to produce the best with some simple game rules to solve this problem. So it's a way of gamifying the research, which is pretty efficient, but which does not lead really to solutions that are certificable and that are explainable in a way. And in general, this way of working of the scientific community takes out, but this is more general in science, especially in mathematics, does not consider the consequences of what people are doing. They are just looking at the problem from a purely technical point of view. So these are probably the causes of the crisis, or some causes of the crisis artificial intelligence is living right now. But the scientific community, of course, is looking for solutions. So, for example, regarding the bias, there is a lot of work now on trying to define, detect, avoid, repair biases. On the problem of betraying participants' personal information, there is a mathematical model of differential privacy now addressing this. Yes, and all these different problems that I just mentioned are having technical solutions, or at least the community is trying to find technical solutions for these problems. And well, in a way, what we are discussing today is how much those technical solutions are likely to provide durable and truly outcomes to the trap artificial intelligence seems to be in right now. So this is just an example. We said before that the models produced by artificial intelligence were not interpretable, and that it was really hard to understand why a dog is classified as a dog and why a guitar is classified as a guitar. So people have been trying to find a solution, so local, interpretable, model agnostic explanation to find, at least in the image, what are the pixels that were causing this decision. So here an example, you see the pixels that caused the classification of this image to guitar or to Labrador. And this kind of research has brought a lot of famous unexpected effects, so, which are pretty well known now. So for example, this was in a problem of classification where you wanted to know how to distinguish between a wolf and a husky and a dog. So the system was working pretty well. So we were wondering how does it do? Where in the pixel does it look to take always the good decision? And what appeared to be the decisive elements to take this decision in the case of this image are those pixels. So it's the snow next to the animal that permits to make the difference between the dog and the wolf. So pretty unexpected. And how does it come that we get some strange behavior of automatic decision systems? So I would like to conclude with my 5 minutes with some words on the biases. So first, there were bias in the data. So here you have a few images taken from a learning set. The example is taken from the book cited below, an introduction to image datasets. And what is striking here is that you have examples of sharks, of trout, and of homar here. And well, you don't see them exactly in the same context, all of them. So here you might learn to recognize a shark because it lives deep in the sea, a homar because it lives in a plate, and a trout because it has been fished. And in fact, the data very often presents this kind of biases. And so what is learned by the algorithm is obviously pretty much impacted by this bias in the data. So what are the consequences? They have already been evoked today. So I'm very quick on this example. The fact that the dark skin were underrepresented in facial recognition systems caused the system to be very unfair in terms of the capacity of recognition to the minorities that were underrepresented. And it's not the only example, of course. When you think about automatic medicine, it's a very frightening example. You know that a large part of the DNA sequences that are obtained and used in medicine are from specific origins, people from specific origins that do not uniformly represent the humanity. And the fact that it might be used to build new pills and new medications is certainly a signal that we should expect those medications to work better for some populations than for others. And so there have been lots of attempts to formalize fairness. Those attempts have been very well presented by Alice a few minutes ago. First, to detect biases at an individual or at a group level. In particular, the disparate impact, as already mentioned, is one technical way to do it. But what you should remember from this slide is that there are several technical solutions to define what is a bias. As Alice mentioned, demographic parity, equal opportunity, causal fairness, all of these are possible technical solutions that lead to different solutions, in fact, different behaviors. And so, well, the community is trying to solve the problem by including those new aspects in the models and then continue to think inside of the model. So for example, here, when you look at this problem of you should make predictions and maybe your best predictor is very unfair, then you can look at the best fair predictor. Unfortunately, it's very inefficient. So very recent work tried to find the best possible balance between those two things, trying to be a little less fair than perfectly fair, but a lot more efficient, and finding the most balance is sometimes doable. So there is very recent work who showed the possibility of optimally making decisions to find the best balance between efficiency and fairness. And this way to modify the objective is a way to include into the model the possibility to use fairness. But that will be my last word. This is completely dependent on the definition you take for what you call fairness. And believe it or not, so mathematicians, when they propose such a solution, they take the definition of fairness that is the most easy to manipulate for them and the one that will simplify the computations that are, apart from this, very, very difficult. So it's a very classical way of technicians to solve a problem, to include the formalization of the problem that is the more handy and the more manipulable for them to provide solutions. And so the discussion should never stop, and there should continue to be always a critical view on the solutions provided by technicians, because they are not fair themselves in the way they are modeling the data, but they are using the problems, they are using the models that they can handle. Okay, I think I should stop here. I have used the time that I was given. So thanks for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much, Aurélien. You're perfectly on time. So thank you for your presentation. It's very, very rich and raises very important issues. In particular, the notion of trade-off between efficiency and fairness you referred to in the last slide. So I give the floor to the discutant. Alexis Tsokias. Alexis.
Okay, hi everybody. And thanks very much for these presentations. Really very interesting. I will make a very short comments and question to each of the three this evening participants. Starting with Alice. Alice, you introduce fairness, no, under a point of view of, let's say, fairness among demographic groups, no? So that means that fairness is something which is defined among groups which are structured on, let's say, external attributes. We group the people together because they have the same gender, they live in the same district, they have the same age, level of education, or whatever. No? Now the problem is that for some topics, no, that would work fine, but there are several issues about fairness, at least from an economic point of view, no, in which fairness is very much subjectively defined. And clustering of the population is done along lines of, let's say, welfare perception or welfare appreciation. No? So we cannot cluster the population because they belong to the same demographic group, but because they have the same values, let's say. No? Which means that if I want to be fair, I have to treat these people who are subjectively define themselves as similar. No? So if I am fair because I treat similarly people that are similar, but people are similar because they subjectively feel to be similar, it is another type of problem that I have to handle. Now, this is something which joins what Solon presented. No? Solon tells us that for certain type of problems, let's say borrowing money, but I will give another example which is even more striking. No, we do not have in objective clustering of the population on which we have to be fair. And we have conflicting preferences. No? Let me give an example which is similar to what Solon gave. No? This has to do with how do we price tickets for the flights. No? Yield management is a 30 years old, 40 years old business. No? And it shaped how the whole airline industry and the tourism industry in the last 30 years. It is algorithmically driven. No? Now, we compute automatically the price of each single seat we sell in the airline industry. People feel that it is something that benefits them because they have now seats that are sold on a very cheap, no? But it changed the way through which people have to organize their travel dramatically. Because you cannot change your flight, for instance. No? Why? Because pricing is done in order to maximize profit, not in order to maximize the welfare of certain groups of traveling people. No? Now, the way through which we organize, no, and we design, no, our algorithms have to do with economic or political or whatever choices, no, which most of the times we never discussed. No? Now, joining what Aurélien was telling us, it is clear that as we move from, let's say, traditional algorithmic decision devices to more artificial intelligence or machine learning driven devices, there is a problem, no, on pre-establishing what are the features we want to satisfy. Now, this in economics is known as mechanism design. No? So you do not establish the mechanism. You establish what are the axioms you want to satisfy, and then you find which are the procedures that satisfy, no, what you want to obtain. Now, perhaps it is time, because I am a computer scientist, no? Perhaps it is time for computer scientists to introduce mechanism design as a constraint for algorithm design. No? In the sense that we need to say, what do we want the procedure to satisfy? This is very much an economic, a political, a social, a legal topic. It's not a technical topic. No? But then as soon as lawyers or economists or political scientists, they tell us that what we want from a device to satisfy, then it can become a constraint on how to conceive a device, a mechanism, an algorithm, a software that will more or less satisfy these constraints. And this is not something we do today. The whole business on how algorithms are designed is not driven by what we want to satisfy, no? But from what we are more or less able to do technically or from some other perspective who nobody knows. No? And I will stop here. It was very nice in any case. Thanks for your interventions.
Okay, thank you, Alexis, for your comments. Maybe the three speakers want to react shortly to your comments. Alice?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to take a step. So yeah, I think those are all great questions and points. So I would say sort of first to the point of how to define the relevant groups. So certainly I would say the techniques proposed in algorithmic fairness literature are not specific to demographic groups. And so you can define the group however you'd like. And that is part of the challenge in terms of doing algorithmic fairness in practice. What are the relevant groups? Typically, folks do think of this more in terms of demographics or external groups because the goal is often to address historical discrimination. And as a result, it doesn't necessarily matter so much the values or preferences of the individuals necessarily in that aspect if all you're trying to do is measure discrimination, which is more how they would be perceived by other parties and thus treated differently historically, and their outcomes might be different as a result. Of course, I think as Solon's presentation highlighted, oftentimes we should question our notions of what it means to be advantaged or disadvantaged, and also whether the objectives that we perceive as being positive or negative are actually such. And that's really important when we're thinking about specific domains where it's not totally clear that having the positive outcome is actually necessarily good either on the individual or aggregate level. So I think that's also a very important question in terms of defining the objectives, both for the model itself and also for any sort of fairness intervention. And regarding the point of mechanism design, I think that is a really interesting area of research, and there have been increasingly papers in the algorithmic fairness space that do draw from mechanism design and game theory. One thing that is always important to be, I think, a little bit cautious about, especially when we're talking about algorithmic fairness, is oftentimes we're dealing explicitly with contexts where people either have not necessarily been acting completely rationally as reflected in the data, or the type of rationality also reflects some biased preferences that we don't necessarily want to perpetuate. And so in this case, there is, I think, a need to be careful when we import methodology from game theory, which doesn't always necessarily take into account these aspects. So I think in also thinking about more of the socio-technical and historical and legal components is quite important as we're interpreting the data and trying to generate models of human behavior.
Thank you, Alice. Solon?
Yeah, I also really appreciate these questions.
Say a word?
Sure. I also really appreciate the questions. And I also put a link in the chat to a paper that I think is trying to explore some of the connections between mechanism design and the work on fairness and machine learning. And in fact, one of the authors on the paper is actually Manish, who is the co-author of the paper I just presented. I agree. I think, like, in general, the fact that a lot of the work on fairness and machine learning doesn't really focus on welfare, but instead is interested in kind of the outcomes of decision-making processes, can leave a lot off the table. And so at a minimum, I think like a welfare orientation can really reveal a lot that is otherwise eclipsed by a lot of the ways that people tend to think about this. There have been a number of papers who have tried to point this out. So there's some work that kind of shows that naive approaches that pick up on some of these definitions of fairness can lead to often like counterintuitive and sometimes even perverse welfare consequences. So even for the groups that you might be particularly concerned with. So in general, I think there's a lot more work to be done that tries to sort of reconcile what we're trying to achieve when we adopt some of these fairness measures with a lot of the ways that people also tend to think about welfare. And I actually think that maybe that even speaks to a point that I thought Alice made very nicely, which was that it can be important to really clarify what is the harm that we're trying to like reverse, or what is the kind of positive goal that we're trying to pursue here. And I think in general that can be left pretty underspecified. And at least in the work with Manish, certainly in credit, like if you even scratch a little bit beyond the surface, you can begin to recognize that the objective function of the decision maker is way more complex than we often assume. And that can then obviously just lead to all sorts of like unintentional or harmful outcomes that are otherwise not really being thought of when we would adopt these things. So I don't have a clear answer for you except to say like there is a debate beginning to happen along these lines, and I think there's probably more work to do.
Thanks, Solon. Aurélien, you want to react shortly?
Yeah, so to keep time, I don't have anything to add to the very nice answers of Alice and Solon, except to support the suggestion of Alexis that seems to me very relevant on mechanism design for machine learning.
Yeah, thank you, Alexis. Thank you, to all of you. I have a few questions, and I'll start with Alice shortly. First, in the US, there are commissions in the field of employment of credit, which are equal opportunities commissions. So my question is, do these commissions, like the equal employment opportunity commissions, have a logic of affirmative action? So in connection with the notion of anti-subordination, which is in tension with the anti-classification you referred to earlier. Is there a gap or not between the rationale of these commissions aiming at guaranteeing equality of opportunity and the case law, the jurisprudence you were referring to? So that's first part of my question. The second relates more precisely to the HUD rule you refer to in your paper. And it seems, if I clearly understood, that this rule is based on the decision, the Texas Department of Housing decision, which reveals the notion of causality. But it seems to be that this decision, maybe I'm wrong in interpreting the decision like that, but it has restricted, or more precisely, imposed the plaintiff a burden of proof which is higher than previously. So the causality relates to the demonstration of the impact of a precise measure or rules at the origin of a disproportional result. So that's the question I want to ask Alice. I have a question to Solon and a comment. I start with a comment. I found your paper very, very interesting. So it's not. I'm quite familiar with the way you state your argument, because it's I am an economist. So you are you're using economics preferences, utility, cost, and so on. It seems to me that the question of explanation is too discrete in your paper. So, so that's a short comment. My question is: have you considered making a simulation of your model or not? So I stop here. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, I guess I'm happy to go first. So yeah, great questions. Thank you. So regarding the first, so I would say that so with, for example, the EOC and similar sorts of commissions, one thing that is a common misunderstanding, I would say, at least in the algorithmic fairness community, is a lot of folks assume that disparate impact is pretty straightforward. It's essentially if you see a disparity in terms of the, for example, rates of hiring or rates of admission in a certain context. And so there's often citations, for example, to the 80-20 rule under the EEOC. But that's actually just the very initial form of inquiry. So typically disparate impact has a multi-leveled inquiry. The basic goal of disparate impact is not to say if there's any disparity that is legally actionable. It's to say if there is a disparity that shifts the burden of proof to the employer, to the entity making a decision, to show that they are not using a discriminatory process. And so you still need to show that there is some logic for why it's reasonable or unreasonable to use these sorts of features in your decision-making process. And so in that sense, this is also where the way such commissions think about discrimination can be at odds with bias mitigation efforts, because if you think about it as, so we realize there's disparate impact in a certain process. So maybe there's a much, much lower rate of hiring for one group versus another. And then the commission might ask the group, well, what is your decision-making process? What features do you use? And so then if none of the features they use sound like a protected attribute or a close proxy, then the result might be, okay, well, in that case, your decision-making process is considered to be fair. But of course, that becomes a problem in the machine learning context where you could have many features that are not very interpretable, that are not clearly proxies, but might still lead to discriminatory outcomes. And conversely, if you're applying some sort of bias mitigation technique, you might actually be using the protected attribute in your model, not directly as a feature per se, but maybe in some other sort of step, either in a constraint or maybe in some pre-processing step. But that can actually potentially increase your liability in such an investigation if the commission is not very careful with how it thinks about the different uses of the protected attribute. And so I think in that sense, even the way such commissions think about discrimination is reflective of this broader trend to conflate the presence or absence of the protected attribute with fairness or lack thereof. And then with the Texas case, this is one where I don't think the court was necessarily very cognizant of this distinction between the presence and absence of protected attributes and causality versus not. But it was nice that the court did reaffirm that the core inquiry from a legal perspective around discrimination should be about causality. And that's part of the irony then when you read the HUD proposed rule, which fortunately did not become a final regulation, but the proposed rule says it was inspired by the Texas decision, but the way the agency interpreted the mandate to look for this causal connection is by simply saying, if you don't use protected attributes, then you're good. And if you do use it, then you're bad. So again, I think that's part of why it's very helpful to point out for both folks on the legal and regulatory side that these things are not the same, especially when we're talking about machine learning. And then for folks on the technical side, typically whenever you read an algorithmic fairness paper, people assume that they have access to a variable on gender or race or whatever the attribute of interest is. And the reality in practice is it's actually quite difficult to have access to that kind of information. And so then that changes what kinds of fairness interventions are possible in practice.
And by the way, in the European Union, there is absolutely no way to have any racial data. It is strictly forbidden. It's not that there is no racial discrimination, but we cannot see it on official statistical data.
Yes, and yeah, exactly. That's part of the motivation for this piece as well, because there's a lot of assumptions people are making about how you might be able to do algorithmic fairness, and then people wonder why nobody in industry actually uses these techniques. And this is a major reason, because depending on the cultural, the regulatory framework, it might, at minimum everywhere, it's very sensitive private information, and then in certain places, it's also forbidden.
also just respond like,
yeah, simulation or not of your model?
Yeah, well, first I'll say too, like, I'm sorry that I didn't say much more about the style of explanation that we were focused on here, but actually within the United States, there's a pretty live debate unfolding about how regulators probably should give guidance about satisfying those legal requirements for explanation that are imposed on lenders. And my general impression is that this thing called counterfactual explanations, which was largely developed within like kind of machine learning community, has a lot of traction. And so what I was using as the kind of ongoing assumption in that presentation was that this would be a counterfactual explanation. But there are problems with that, which I discussed elsewhere. But yeah, there's a lot more to say here about the style explanation. But as for simulation, yes. So there's two things in particular that we're hoping to do. So one is that I'm very interested in kind of simulating like kind of longer term dynamics. So like the prior work that tried to do this was just looking at the fact that people who end up defaulting incur some like penalty when they apply for loans again in the future. So like the people who are harmed in that case are the people who default. I'm kind of more interested at a system level. So like when the lender has to incur more cost because there's higher default, how does that get then passed on to the rest of the population? And then how does that then change who can gain access to credit over the long term? And that's a simulation that we're figuring out right now. And the other simulation is to actually like try to do some of the stuff that's more focused on the explanation. And we're also kind of considering how to do that. So yes, that is definitely the direction we're headed.
Okay, thank you, Solon. I think the time is over. Maybe a question to Aurélien. Aurélien, you have collaborated with lawyers, with jurists. And did this collaboration change a bit or not the way you work on IA?
Yeah, definitely. So thank you for the question. It's important to address this. Actually, I have worked with people from philosophy and with people with lawyers, and definitely it has convinced me of two things. The first one is that we should be able to explain our assumptions and our process of producing algorithms collectively, and not only on an individual level, because it is not at all an evidence, an obviousness as we thought it was, simply being inside and doing it. There are lots of, as I try to say, of biases that come from the community itself and the way it works, and not only from the individual choices. And the second thing is that it's really hard to understand the logic of the law from my perspective. For example, I was very interested by Alice's claim about causality in a legal perspective. So for me, causality is a technical term in statistics, and I was very interested to hear about this because of property that is decisive from a legal point of view. And for me, it's a source of a lot of confusion and frightenness, in fact, because I'm wondering whether the automatic decision systems, and in particular machine learning, cannot be used to hide not really a very elegant intentions behind technique. You can, if you're very smart, you can probably achieve the goals you want, hiding the real causes behind some complicated decision process where it cannot be traced back anymore. So actually, if I had the time, that is maybe the question I would ask to Alice, whether she thinks this kind of problems already has happened, and if lawyers are aware of this difficulty.
Yeah, if we have time, I'm happy.
Okay, we can take some extra minutes to give the floor to Alice.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say that there's sorts of a few layers of this. So I think the worst case is actually what we have right now, where it's very, very easy to hide discrimination, because if the notion of what might be discriminatory, see you, Solon. If the notion is basically around whether you have protected class attributes or not, that is extremely easy to conceal. And most of the examples, if not all the examples of algorithmic bias in the literature, are cases where there is no protected attribute in the feature set. And so none of that discrimination would necessarily be detected if we're just thinking very simplistically in that way. I think the push towards thinking more critically about the causal underpinnings should ideally at least alleviate some of that very naive notion of fairness. But at the same time, of course, causality is quite difficult, and really tracing back the causal modeling that has generated the data that you're using to train your model involves many assumptions and ideally a lot of domain expertise in terms of the data generating processes. So in that sense, I don't think that causal reasoning is necessarily a simple solution, but at least hopefully it refocuses attention a little bit in terms of it's not necessarily enough just to show disparities. You also need to be able to trace back what is a causal mechanism explaining that disparity if you want to be able to make a legal case around discrimination.
Okay. Thank you very much for the answer.
So the time is over. So I want to warmly thank you, the three speakers of this session.
Excuse-moi, sorry, Thierry. I'd like to say rapidly, briefly.
Very shortly, Antoine, excuse me. Very shortly.
So there has been a question about the competition authorities and the problem with algorithms. And there has been a common study of the French and German authorities about collusion. And in fact, they seem to say that at this stage, they don't have to change the scope of law about collusion and cartels. And secondly, after what has said Alexis and the discussion after all, I think that we are dealing from a legal standpoint with what we call one of the principles, for instance, of the Commission Nationale, the National Commission for Computer and Freedom. It's the principle of continued attention and vigilance. That's to say that if we, what is at stake, if really compliance increases through hard and soft law, that's to say that legally the design and the objective and the aim which will be more framed. Because of course, what is at stake, it's that through compliance, the biases and the competition and everything would be, so what Alexis says is in the trend of the legal pressure on, whether it's very interesting to see that technically it will be complicated. But anyway, it's the trend of the law being hard or soft. That's what I wanted to say. And thank you very much for this very interesting speeches and interventions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Antoine. Thank you for having asked the questions that are scripted in the chat. Thank you once again, and I wish you, according to your locations, so American fellows, a good day. For the others, a good night. Thank you. So the workshop will continue tomorrow morning for the last session. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.